If you have heard of John Green, it might be because you've read one of his books, watched The Fault in Our Stars, or have confused him in the past with his brother Hank Green, or most likely you've stumbled across one of his shorts on YouTube where he discusses TB because, as he puts it, everything is about tuberculosis.
To fight tuberculosis.
Tuberculosis predates humanity and has evolved alongside us, infecting not only humans, but many other mammals as well. Proof of its existence has been found in Egyptian mummies from 5,000 years ago, and in ancient human remains that have been uncovered in India, China, Peru. Its effects were well known in the ancient world, where it was known as phthisis. The Greek philosopher and physician Hippocrates explained that phthisis makes its attacks chiefly between the age of 18 and 35, and that it was the most considerable of the diseases which then prevailed, and the only one which proved fatal to many persons. In the following centuries, one of the many symptoms of tuberculosis became known as scrofula, and it was believed that it could only be cured if a monarch touched the infected person, resulting in hundreds begging for an audience so that they or their loved ones could be healed. In the 18th century, it also became known as the White Plague because it left victims looking pale and thin. In 1819, it became known as consumption in Europe due to how the illness seemed to consume the body of its victim. People who suffered from consumption were thin, they had the pale skin, wide eyes, rosy cheeks, and suffering from consumption somehow became a fashion statement. Women started avoiding the sun and wearing makeup to make their skin look paler. They started wearing red tints on their cheeks to achieve the feverish look. They put belladonna in their eyes to make them look wider and brighter with fever. And corsets helped the fashion-conscious female look slim and malnourished. Many literary figures gave their heroines characteristics which resembled that of a person dying of consumption, which included pale skin, wide eyes, slim figures, and a habit of fainting due to shortness of breath. Lord Byron even wished to die of consumption one day because the ladies would all say, "Look at that poor Byron, how interesting he looks in dying." Tuberculosis became known as the disease of the impoverished artist. It killed the stage actress Elizabeth Poe, mother of Edgar Allan Poe, when he was just 2 years old. It killed the English poet John Keats and Frédéric Chopin, the Polish composer. But it also killed John Harvard, George Canning, who was a British Prime Minister, and James Monroe, the 5th President of the US. But it didn't just target the rich and famous and creatively tortured. In the early 19th century, tuberculosis had reached endemic proportions and killed an estimated 100,000 people per year, people who were poor and malnourished and worked in the harshest of environments. This led to it becoming known as the white man's plague. Scientists and physicians all over Europe studied the disease and its symptoms, but they all had different theories as to what caused it. Some theorized the consumption was caused by inhaling foul air. Others speculated that it was a heritable disease, but medical practitioners in the south of Europe and in the east still knew it as phthisis and still knew that it was contagious. In the early 19th century, French physician René Laennec studied the remains of victims of consumption and pointed out that the disease ravaged the lungs of its victims, causing them to rot away to nothing. This led to the invention of the stethoscope in 1816 to better enable physicians to diagnose the illness early on. But it wasn't until March of 1882 that German physician and microbiologist Robert Koch identified the bacteria that caused consumption, calling it Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and finally giving the disease the name that we know it by today. In the years that followed, studies into the disease continued, and by the 1960s, we finally had a reliable 4-drug treatment for tuberculosis. As a result, it slowly faded from the mind of Western civilization, despite still being prevalent in many Eastern and African countries. When the HIV pandemic started in 1981, one of the leading causes of death in people suffering from AIDS was tuberculosis, and this once again brought it to the attention of the Western world and its pharmaceutical companies, who quickly began to produce the 4-drug regimen prescribed to treat tuberculosis. But the number of persons being diagnosed with TB spiked into the millions, and in 1993 the World Health Organization declared that tuberculosis was now a global health emergency. But now you might be wondering, well, what is tuberculosis? The bacteria Mycobacterium tuberculosis is transmitted when an infected person who is actively displaying symptoms of tuberculosis coughs and releases aerosol droplets containing the bacteria into the air. The bacteria can then enter a person's lungs or settle on a surface while the surrounding spit dries up. There, it can wait for weeks until an unsuspecting victim touches the surface, sending the bacteria flying into the air, and then they breathe it in. Once inside the lungs, the bacteria inhibits the body's natural defenses, allowing it to grow and infect the lungs, resulting in primary tuberculosis. By this point, the infected person is asymptomatic or only displays mild flu-like symptoms. 3 weeks later, the person's immune system starts to kill off the disease, resulting in scar-like blemishes in lungs called gonfocuses, which is essentially a protective crust that is built around the diseased tissue and contains the disease. In some cases, the TB bacteria is killed off and the person no longer risks developing TB. But in others, the bacteria is simply dormant. The person no longer displays any symptoms of tuberculosis, isn't infectious, and can go up to 2 years without knowing that they have primary TB, after which the risk of developing the disease is further significantly reduced. This all changes, however, as soon as the infected person's immune system is compromised, which can be caused by malnutrition, illness, old age, or viral infections like HIV. This results in the gonfocuses containing the dormant bacteria failing, which releases the bacteria back into the lungs. The bacteria then moves to the upper lobes of the lungs, where it either starts attacking the lungs, resulting in bronchopneumonia, or starts attacking the rest of the body. This is known as systemic miliary TB, and this is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to diagnose tuberculosis. If the bacteria continue to attack the lungs, it becomes known as pulmonary tuberculosis, which results in chest pain, night sweats, weight loss, and a prolonged wet cough, which might produce blood. But systemic miliary TB can cause meningitis, pot disease, Addison's disease, hepatitis, or lymphadenitis in the neck. One of the ways to test for primary tuberculosis is by performing an intradermal skin test, during which a component of the TB bacteria, called tuberculin, is injected into the skin. If the patient develops a reaction to the injection within the next 48 to 72 hours, the patient is positive for having come into contact with the bacteria. But to determine whether the patient is actively suffering from TB, further diagnostic tests have to be run, such as x-rays, blood tests, and testing samples of the patient's sputum or spit. If the patient tests positive for TB, but the disease isn't active, the patient will have to take a drug called isoniazid for 9 months. If the patient is actively suffering from TB, a mixture of antibiotics, injections, and other medication is prescribed for a minimum of 4 to 6 months until tests confirm that the patient no longer has TB. Patients with active TB are treated using DOTS, or direct observed therapy, which requires the patient to take their medication under the direct supervision of a medical professional. This is because if a single dose is missed, treatment has to start all over again, or the patient runs the risk of the disease becoming resistant to the medication provided. In summary, we know how TB is caused. We know how to diagnose it, how to treat it, and how to prevent others from being affected. And yet, millions still die from tuberculosis every year, making it the deadliest infectious disease of all time. In 1997, the World Health Organization established the Global Tuberculosis Program, whose aim is to end the tuberculosis epidemic by 2030. According to their 2023 Global Tuberculosis Report, an estimated 10 million people are currently infected with tuberculosis, but only 7.5 million of those people were diagnosed with TB in 2022. That same year, 1.3 million people passed away as a result of tuberculosis, making it the world's second leading cause of death from a single infectious agent after the coronavirus disease. These days, tuberculosis is most prevalent in eastern countries like India, Indonesia, and Pakistan, as well as the Philippines and Vietnam. Although there are still millions of people who are diagnosed with tuberculosis all over the world. In countries like the US, the EU, Japan, and China, patients with TB receive treatment and are declared to be cured within 4 to 6 months. However, in most third world countries, several factors result in these patients developing drug-resistant TB or passing away. The first is a lack of proper medical facilities. According to the WHO, there are several tests that can be performed to diagnose a person with TB, but all of them require access to lab equipment so that a culture test can be performed. Without these facilities, it's difficult to determine the level of treatment that a patient requires, and the patient runs the risk of not only developing drug-resistant TB, but also suffering permanent side effects from the strong medication they're given. Another challenge that many patients with TB face is DOTS itself. Because it requires that the patient has to be closely monitored, these patients have to be able to remain in treatment facilities for between 4 and 6 months, or come in every day to take the medication. Since many of these patients are the breadwinners in their families, they can't afford to stay in a treatment facility, and traveling to and from a medical facility every day is costly, and in some cases it's simply impossible. Furthermore, many of the people affected by tuberculosis live in impoverished areas. That close proximity to each other, a lack of proper bathroom facilities or access to water, a lack of proper nourishing food, and limited access to medical facilities means that their homes are the perfect breeding ground for tuberculosis. And since only 1 out of 4 of these people are likely to get diagnosed, the odds of the rest of their family being infected with tuberculosis, it's high. Every day, the scientific and medical community are making progress in the fight against tuberculosis. Rapid urine tests are available, but a culture test is still needed properly to diagnose a TB patient. TB medicine is becoming cheaper to produce, and over 40 million people have already been provided with the medication they need to beat the illness. The WHO actively educates children and families in affected countries regarding the illness, and food programs in schools help fight malnutrition, which is one of the risk factors for developing tuberculosis. Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the WHO, explains that, quote, "For millennia, our ancestors have suffered and died with tuberculosis without knowing what it was, what caused it, or how to stop it. Today we have knowledge and tools they could have only dreamed of. We have political commitment, and we have an opportunity that no generation in the history of humanity has had, the opportunity to write the final chapter in the story of TB. But until we can put a stop to HIV and AIDS, until we can bring an end to poverty and provide every person in the world with quality healthcare, tuberculosis is going to be with us for at least another decade to come. And maybe for another decade after that."